Remember high school? In 1977, every Monday morning, I would go to my high school library. I would open up the New York Times to look for ads for concerts in their full-page glory. I would then gather up my friends to save the date. We would buy blocks of tickets, check the train schedule, and head to New York City. These ads held for me what I like to call an emotional promise. They held the potential for huge excitement, a communal event, get them while they're hot tickets, and express the joy of the big city. And a year or two later, plays and musicals began to speak to me in the same way. I remember this one great fall of Ain't Misbehavin', Joe Egg, and Sweeney Todd, all original casts. These ads told me what was special about these shows, by their size, by their placement, by their style, by their emotional promise. In 1996, after a decade of working on entertainment graphic design for clients like Swatch, Watch, and MTV, Geffen Records rang me and asked me to go see a new show called Rent. I remember standing online to get my tickets at New York Theater Workshop, right behind playwright Wendy Wasserstein. And when she got her tickets, she turned to me and fanned them with gleam in her eye, like Charlie in Willy Wonka land. We both knew something special was happening and my life was about to change. When we began work on the Rent logo, I didn't know it, but I was working from a series of personal hunches. I was marketing to myself, and you can do that almost instinctively. But in the beginning of Rent, there were many people who wanted to sell Rent to a rock and roll fan. I had a hunch that this fan was already well served by the New York City music scene, and rock and roll tickets cost way less than Broadway tickets. So I said to the producers, hey, let's not sell Rent to the rock and roll fan, because that's not what Rent is. Rent's a true Broadway musical, and we should sell it to the people who already like those. I implored them that there were more people like me out there, people who had seen musicals when they were younger and knew what they were and might even go to a new one if they were marketed to emotionally. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, truth in advertising and the emotional promise. When I began working on the branding for Rent, smart people, advertising people, told me not to photograph the cast, that they were unknowns. But I wanted to capture the emotional heat that they were giving. Looking back, there were so many ways we could have, might have marketed Rent. Here's a list. The sudden tragic loss of Jonathan Larson. There were the blazing reviews off Broadway. There was the East Village world the characters live in. There was the AIDS activism that surrounded those characters. And then there were the themes of La Boheme throughout the show. But producers Jeffrey Seller, Kevin McCollum, and myself decided to market one thing, how it would feel to go. And that wasn't on anybody's list. So we came up with this. So that same year, producers Barry and Fran Weissler invited me to work on Chicago. Cindy Adams had written a column complaining that Chicago was actually a glorified concert. And we were going to charge the outrageous Broadway ticket price of $75. This was in the age of swinging chandeliers and gondolas in the fog, and so spectacle was in. But I wanted to capture the sizzle the cast was giving, not the jailhouse plot. So here's some of the things we might have marketed on Chicago. There was the sexy black of the overall show. There were the legendary creators, Kander and Ebb. There's the revival of a little-known show, perhaps a flop. There was the extraordinary women's performances in the show, and there was this sort of less is more idea. All of these were true elements of the show, so which one to focus on? I decided to try and solve a perceived marketing pothole, value for dollar, by owning the minimalism. But how to do that? We ultimately decided that black and white fashion photography was the answer. Why? Well, the thinking was that when Calvin Klein runs a black and white fashion ad, No one thinks he doesn't have the budget for color. There were problems. Some key members of Chicago told me I had turned the show into pornography. But the reason this advertising, I think, has such longevity even today are the emotional promises we made right from the very beginning. And the promises the advertising makes are the exact same promises the show delivers on night after night. And when your advertising delivers the same emotion that your show does, then your word of mouth soars. Skip to 2011. I was standing with producer Margot Lyon watching a run-through of Catch Me If You Can, when she turned to me and said, I'm really not sure, I like it, but I'm not sure what the event is. And I said to her, wait, what does that mean? And she said, I don't really know. I'm not sure what that term explains for me. But I became obsessed with what its meaning could be. So my definition is an event is how a guest recommends your project, your show, your vision, your story to another potential ticket buyer in positive terms. So how do you define your event? Okay, here goes. First, know your specific audience. Then define the selling points you have as assets. Every show has tons. Make a list, then rearrange that list till you get them in order of strength. Then consider any built-in negatives from the beginning. But here's the big deal. Here's the most important thing I want to say. Are your promises true? You're promising an audience something truly special. Can you deliver on them? What happens when your promises aren't true? Your word of mouth literally sinks. Can your promises be handed on from one person to the next? Not every promise is easily passed on. And this leads me to another term that I love to use over the years, and it's the non-event. The non-event is simple. The non-event is the lowest common denominator. It is literally the thing you would least like someone to say about your project. But this is what I've learned, and it took me the longest time to learn. This is the hardest thing. If you don't create your own event, one that is true, powerful, delivers an emotional promise, and is easily transferred from one person to the next, then your consumer will default to the non-event. And that is not what you want. I don't always get this right. Sometimes you pick the wrong thing to be the event. Sometimes there is no right thing. I worked on a show called Big Fish that I loved. It ran on Broadway for 132 performances, but through its wonderful qualities, it lives on. If you're watching this at home and you don't know Big Fish, that's on me. That proves my point. I didn't get this right. So here's some things we could have marketed Big Fish as their event. So there were the great reviews in Chicago. In fact, we got middling reviews, but what the hell do they know in Chicago? So it's a score and lyrics by Andrew Lippa. Audiences weren't sure who he was. There was a story of a dying man and the tall tales he tells his son, and that is sad and male. There was a great leading performance by Norbert Leo Butz. People didn't know who that was. There was a love story, which is probably what we should have gone with. There was Southern charm. Fran Weiser once said to me, charm equals boring. There was a film based by Tim Burton that was visually very cool, and it was directed on Broadway by Susan Stroman of producer's fame, and that is what we went with. In the end, none of these were quite right, and a wonderful show closed too early. You do not always get it right, but sometimes you do. I was fortunate enough to see the first reading in New York City. The Act 1 was staged in street clothes and powdered wigs. Act 2 just sung. And I said to myself, this is the best musical theater I have ever seen. Producer Jeffrey Seller came up to me, said, what'd you think? I said, this is the best musical theater I've ever seen, and I'll tell you why. I went back to the office and told them it was the best musical theater I'd ever seen, and they mocked me. So, but in the end, the rest is history. But we began to think really hard about the non-event. I was convinced this was the one show everyone could love, from a granddaughter to a grandmother. And all we needed was for the marketing to stay out of the way of the show and for the audience to be the broadest possible one you could imagine. That was my goal. A dear Broadway marketing friend of mine says to me, marketing to everyone is marketing to no one, which is a very good phrase, except for this time, I didn't think it was right. I define the non-event to be hip-hop history, which Lynn would say on occasion. This is why. If you love hip-hop, you might not be that into history. If you love history, you might not be that into hip-hop, and thus we split the audience in half. Yes, I get asked all the time, what was the event for Hamilton? And that's easy. It was the best musical theater you have ever seen. Okay, it's time for my 11 o'clock number. I could deliver an arresting visual that has shock and awe. I could try and take current events and make this forced metaphor. I could use nostalgia to create a feel-good moment. I could invoke Hamilton, which always seems to work. But I chose the third one. After 9/11, Broadway was really uncertain what would come next. Would the show go on? Would consumers feel safe in a theater? Government realized that, in fact, Broadway was the face of New York City, if not the country. And the best way to send a message that business was alive and well here was to bring a message of a resurgent great white way. Some Broadway marketing friends and I began to come together to think about creating a television commercial. We wanted to do nothing less than create an emotional promise for the theater. On a stunning Tuesday, we invited all of Broadway's performers to come together at the Schubert Theater for free, in full costume, to rehearse and perform and tape a TV commercial in Times Square. I don't believe all of Broadway has ever been brought together before in one place at one time in the modern age. We were the first people allowed back in Times Square, which had been sealed off. Director Jerry Mitchell choreographed with a bullhorn, and all union workers worked pro bono. I was standing outside the Schubert Theater waiting to address the performers when I heard a loud rhythmic jangling sound. It grew louder, and we looked up, and around the corner came the entire Rockettes in a kick line across an empty Times Square, there to lend support. And we all fell apart with tears and emotion. I can feel it right now, how I felt then. We wanted to create an emotional promise for Broadway, a promise that was true, a promise that was resonant for our audience, a promise that only we could say, a promise filled with resiliency, creativity, community, camaraderie, diversity, innovation, all wrapped up in an American, truly American art form, a promise of truth in advertising. Thank you.
We'll make a brand new start of it in old New York. If we can make it there, we'll make it anywhere. It's up to you, New York.
Come to New York and let's go on with the show.